Welcome to Women and Resistance, a powerful podcast where we honor the courage, resilience, and revolutionary spirits of women across the globe. Hosted by Fubara Eneli Esquire and Adesoji Iginla, we uncover untold stories of defiance against systemic oppression, whether colonialism, racism, sexism, or economic injustice. From historic icons like Winnie Mandela and Fannie Lou Hamer to today's trailblazers, we shine a light upon those shaping a more just world. This is a call to honor the past, embrace the present, and build an empowered future. Greetings, and welcome to another episode of Women and Resistance. And I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and with me, as usual, is my sister from another mother, Fubara Eneli Esquire. How are you, sister?
I am doing wonderful this evening. Thank you. And you?
Yes, I am blessed and hot at the same time. Rather hot in the Queen's country. But, we can't complain. We can't complain. So, Bessie Head. We're going to be looking at the lives and times of Bessie Head, how she resisted what was around her at the time, and what we'll come to know is a continuous crisis of our people, especially in that neck of the woods, South Africa. So, over to you, sister. Who is Bessie Head?
Only because I need to get
Breathe.
to her. I need to get to her. I am a woman who can trace no root. Clearly, I come from somewhere and from some people, but I never knew my people. I never knew my mother or the aristocrat family she came from in South Africa as a white woman, and I never knew my father or his people. My father, who was described as a stable boy, the term that white men and women felt was their calling, their power to always reduce us to an infantile state as Black people. As I said, my mother was a white woman from a very wealthy family. They owned a stable of horses, race horses, and as far as I know, my father was a Black South African, and my mother had been married, and that marriage fell apart, and she returned to her family. And in that state of despair, depression as I understand it, she sought love and warmth in the arms of a Black man, and I am the evidence of their time together. Her family, in finding out this great sin, this great crime committed by their daughter, and so as not to bring shame to the family, committed my mother to a mental institution where she lived out the rest of her life and where she died in 1943. I was born on the 6th day of July, 1937. I could still be living today, but of course I am not. I was born in this mental hospital in Pietermaritzburg in South Africa. The reason for my peculiar birthplace was my mother was judged insane and committed to this mental hospital while pregnant. Her name was Bessie Emery. I am Bessie Amelia Head. I suppose I should be honored that the South African officials, the only honor they bestowed on me, was to name me after this unknown, lovely, fragile, unpredictable woman who paid with her life for daring to seek love in the arms of a Black man and bringing me into the world. The origins of my birth were to shape so much of the life that I lived. Can you imagine having no concept of who your people are and yet needing to figure out who you are? Looking at my hands, even now, I don't know if I have the hands of my Black South African grandmother or the hands of my white South African father, to the extent that we can call him South African. I was an anomaly to myself, a mystery to myself. Some may say I inherited my mother's constitution as I battled my own mental health challenges throughout my life. But to the extent that you find it of value to talk with me and to want to know my thoughts and to read my books is a triumph of sorts, I would imagine. I am certain I was not the only one to have such an auspicious birth. I will stop there.
Okay. So, given the very unusual circumstances, even by the most of humane or normals of standards of your birth, what was your childhood like, if you can recall any part of it?
Childhood, what is that? When I think of the only child I bore, I imagine childhood should be a time of love and nurture and self-discovery, connection. I was initially adopted by a white family, and I suppose as my color came in, they realized that they did not have a white child. And again, I faced rejection. One may wonder, at what point do we recall who we are and our experiences? Are there things that are imprinted on our memories when we are not yet aware? Rejected by my birth grandparents, snatched away from my mother, made powerless for her sin, rejected again for being born the wrong color. Eventually, I was given to a colored family. To understand my story, you have to understand something of South Africa and the stratification of people and the hierarchy. White people on top, of course, men always at the apex, and then the coloreds, and then the utterly despised Black people, and then the likes of me who fit in none of those worlds. My foster parents were paid about £3 a month to take care of me. But at some point, I believe my foster father passed away and my foster mother was thrown into abject poverty. And at that point, I was moved to an Anglican boarding school in Durban. Durban, of course, named after a white colonizer. May I digress and ask, why do we still honor these people with these names even today? For that place is still named Durban. Why do we continue to give them places of honor?
I suppose the simple answer would be the minds are still not decolonized yet. We might believe we've decolonized our spaces, but as long as names like that are still abound, and that's not the only place it is, it's across the entire face of Africa. In some places, these names, peoples, events have, sunk their teeth into our very fabric and existence, that we now even revere some of these places. And places that used to be out of bounds for the lesser amongst us is now occupied by the so-called, for want of a better word, colonizers.
Upon taking me to this Anglican boarding school, may I say, I loathe Christianity. When I eventually left that missionary, I vowed never to step foot in a church ever again.
Why?
I don't have a problem with God. I have a problem with the people who brought us their religion, who never lived for a minute the religion they professed to believe in, which they foisted on us. During the breaks, there would be terms and then there would be vacation times, break times when children returned to their homes. I had no home to return to. And a teacher found me in a fetal position under a bush. I was dragged to the principal's office, and the principal then put me in her car and drove me to the magistrate's court. It was there that I was told, quite unceremoniously, that my foster parents, my foster mother, was not my mother at all, and that I was a product of a white woman gone mad. That principal, a missionary, took great pleasure in reading from my file, and it is from her that I gleaned the little bits that I know about my beginnings. Of course, I was always told that I too would eventually go mad, be as insane as my mother. However, although I had no frame of reference to anything beyond myself, I was an avid reader. My mother had made one request, that her money, some of her money, be set aside to ensure that I was educated. The nuns and teachers gave me books. Books became my escape. I would read everything. Dickens, Emily Bronte, African folk tales. In those pages, I found worlds where I could exist, sometimes without shame. I wanted to be a teacher, and I managed to qualify at the age of 16. Teaching was noble. It should always be considered a noble profession. But it was also cruel in the townships. I taught in a place called Clearwood and later in Cape Town. But teaching Black children, for that is all I could teach under the laws, under the apartheid regime, felt like trying to plant seeds in poisoned soil. The very fabric of our humanity was constantly being shredded. How do you learn? How do you grow when your very humanity is questioned? So I walked away from the classroom and I headed to Johannesburg, where I found a different voice. I became a journalist. I wrote for the newspaper, the Golden City Post. How ironic. I suppose maybe from the gold that was being stripped from our land which we no longer owned, land of which we had been dispossessed. I wrote under the shadow of censorship. I flirted with the Pan-African Congress, talking politics in dusty cafes, and I tried to make sense of a world that told me that I was both too much and not enough all at the same time. My internal conflict stayed with me my entire life. I eventually met a man named Harold. He was a fellow journalist. Harold had hopes, as many do, of a beautiful partnership, of building a home, of finding a place where I belonged, some steady ground, some sense of stability, something to anchor me. We had a son together. I told you his name was Howard. Yep. My boy, my only child. He became the steady presence in a life that even I must admit was marked by chaos. But my marriage did not last. I ultimately divorced and decided to apply to teach in Botswana after some friends of mine had gotten caught up with the South African apartheid regime, and I had been called to testify. But South Africa would not grant me a visa to go to Botswana. And the only way I could go was through an exit visa of sorts. In other words, I had to renounce
Your citizenship.
My citizenship.
Which you don't
So
have?
desperate was I, yes, that I did leave for Botswana, a refugee. And it would take quite a few years before Botswana finally would find it worth their while to grant me citizenship.
For those who are not conversant with the landscape, how far is Botswana to South Africa? You are listening to Women and Resistance with Fubara Eneli Esquire and Adesoji Iginla, where we honor the voices of women who have shaped history through courage and defiance. If you're finding these stories inspiring, take a moment to subscribe, share, and support this platform. Together, we amplify the voices that deserve to be heard. Now, back to the conversation.
Well, you can tell them because this is an opportunity for us all to learn.
So Botswana is literally Canada to the United States. And so you would think people that look like you will be embracing of you as opposed to find a reason to exclude you for some society. That is why that question came up. But you were saying, go on.
I never remarried, not because I couldn't, but because I wouldn't. For women, whatever their race. Marriage was supposed to be salvation, supposed to make an honest person of you, supposed to create a sense of security, stability. But I saw it as another cage, because the patriarchy is truly something to behold. At a time in my life, I wrote these words: I am not in need of marriage. I am in need of a deep, pure soul to meet mine. I never did meet that soul. Maybe I was the soul I was seeking. Howard was my family, my anchor, and I raised him alone in an area called Serowe. I have a book by that name. Through drought and darkness, through manic episodes that landed me in an asylum as well, and through literary triumphs, I kept my boy alive. When I was low, he was often the only reason that I stayed alive. When I wrote not just for the world. I wrote not just to make sense of myself and my life. I wrote for him. Serowe, a dusty village with red soil and wide skies. It was there that I began to write in earnest. I'm not quite sure how, given the abject poverty, given my status as a foreigner and a refugee. I lived in poverty with no electricity, no running water. I grew my own food, and in 1968 I wrote my book, When Rain Clouds Gather. It was the story of an exiled South African in a Botswana village. It was my story, fictionalized, and some parts of the world began to take notice. Then, of course, I wrote my book, Maru, and another book, A Question of Power. That book, it nearly destroyed me. You know what effort it takes to stitch yourself together with no one claiming you? Always reminded of your outsider status. For all my eloquence and my mastery of language, I cannot begin to convey to you the heaviness of my existence. Wherever I went, there I was. A Question of Power was perhaps my most personal book and my most painful. Elizabeth, the protagonist, she was me, a woman broken by exile, by mental illness, by spiritual torment. What is it about this religion imposed on us that tells us about a loving, benevolent God? But the carriers of that religion, those who would teach us the religion, were anything but benevolent. I think generosity of spirit, of mind, of body, of soul, that has to be our aim as a people. Yep. The characters who haunted the protagonist in that book were my own. They were my voices, my fears, my demons. Going to bed, waking up, looking for the simplicity in life. Oh my God, I just wanted a simple life. I needed routine. I needed discipline out there in nature. You know what I loved about Botswana was, even as it was being impacted by the same colonizers who had claimed every inch of South Africa and imposed their will on every human being in South Africa, wherever we were. In Botswana, there were some islands, some areas where we could aspire to own ourselves, aspire to eke out a living without the breath and hatred of white people constantly on the base of our necks. But writing that book, A Question of Power, it also saved me. It turned my would-be madness into some meaning. People say I wrote about exile, a physical exile, but it was so much more than that. Many of you may not have experienced a physical exile, although too many in the world have. Yeah. You know, I once wrote about Miriam Makeba and her ability, her gift, how she would sing and pour her heart and soul into these lyrics that in anybody else's mouth would just be words. But with her, you felt a stirring. She understood exile. She understood the pain of it. For me, it was not just a physical exile. It was about spiritual exile. What it means to be cut off from your people, your past, your sense of self, And there are too many Black people across the world who understand this.
Yeah.
Who am I? Who are my people? What makes me respond to things unconsciously, subconsciously? What is this tension, this ever-existing anxiety? And how do you live with it? How do you find joy and love? How do you embrace life in this place of perpetual uncertainty? I wrote about being mixed race. What the hell is that? In a world that demanded binaries, I was both and neither and always in between. My hair. Later, I turned to stories of Botswana, the collector of treasures, Serowe, the village of the rain wind. I was moved by the ordinary people. People who just wanted to live. I was moved by their quiet strength. But I was always also infuriated by the willingness of Black people, of Black men in particular, to accept their oppression, the constant humiliation, to turn around and internalize that hatred, that sense of inferiority that had been projected on them, and to do the same to one another. But I admired the quiet dignity of the ordinary people, those who were constantly in this dance with nature, trying to live, finding reasons to make love and procreate in the midst of so much pain and poverty and hunger. I admired their integrity, their communal spirit, and in my writing, I wanted to honor them. Stateless for years, no passport, no nation. Again, unclaimed, unworthy to be claimed by person or state. And the world never learned. These oppressors never learned. Calling on a God with their heartless, hollowed out hearts. Today, in a place called Gaza, mangled bodies, bombs going off, ripping apart the fabric of human beings on the inside. Not just what we see externally. Have you ever seen a child die of malnutrition? Have you seen a child with their last breath suckling on dried out breasts of a mother who can no longer even shed a tear because she has no tears left in her emaciated body?
In the midst of plenty, by the way.
I was a writer with no homeland. And then the awards started to come, and a little bit of money, running water. Then there were fellowships, invitations to speak. I remained cautious. My application for citizenship denied. I never bothered to apply again. And then one day, I was granted citizenship. I guess I had finally done enough in the world to be claimed. Botswana needed to claim me as their own, as this author, this writer. It was then that I was able to travel, attend conferences, and speak. The literary world supposedly admired me. But how can you admire really what you don't understand?
Yeah.
Nor do you really want to understand, because to understand would be to accept a condemnation that is all of your own. To understand me is to look in the mirror and question how you can sit gorged with plenty while so many innocent lives were slaughtered for your progress, for your success. Can you imagine a people who create the circumstances of your life turning around as you cling to whatever life you can spin? Can you imagine them turning around, sitting in their lofty seats to proclaim you as difficult? And yes, I will wear that as a cloak, a badge of honor. Yes, I am proud of that, which they tried to call me. If I had a philosophy, it would be that we must let people grow. What would have happened to Africa had we not been interrupted? How miserable would be these colonizers had they not found a people and the land, and like parasites, they preyed on us, sucked the very living essence out of us. With everything in me, I abhor systems that crush the spirit. Apartheid, patriarchy, colonialism, neocolonialism, their damn religion. All of it must be dismantled. And if you're listening to the sound of my voice and you have been seduced, sucked into their way of life and thinking, unable to conceive of a world different from their systems and their hierarchy, pity you. We must get quiet enough in our spirits to imagine a different way. Something African leaders seem not to be able to do. Independence? What independence? How do you take on the mannerisms, the systems, the structures of the very people who came to destroy you, who despised everything about who you are? Let me tell you about our people, the people I came to know. The injustices that you see in Africa today could not have existed in the ways that we used to live. We're not the barbarians. I believe in freedom, not just political freedom, but in the freedom of the mind, of the soul. Oh, I searched for a place of peace. Just peace. Can we have peace? Can the so-called illegal immigrants in the United States just have peace? Can Gaza have peace? Can my brothers and sisters, my little children, grandchildren, in Congo, can they have peace? Can we have peace in Liberia? Can we have peace? Can we have peace across the world? But these systems, they are designed to crush and to make us conform. And so we find ways of escape. Some of us literally go mad. Some of us drown ourselves in alcohol, in food, in sex. I was drawn to mysticism. I was drawn to African spiritual traditions. I was drawn to Hinduism, Eastern thought, but not their damn Christianity. I trusted no dogma. At one point, I wrote these words: religion must have no boundaries. It should be as wide as the sky. We don't need religion. Actually, that was the wrong term. I should have talked about that spirituality of a connection that you know you have with God. God, whom I see as generous. And it's that generosity of spirit that we must reclaim. That is how I have tried to live, searching, questioning, seeking peace with myself and with my fellow human beings and with all of nature. I did not live a long life, but I suppose I made my life count. In fact, I'm convinced that I did. In 1986, my body gave out. Years of struggle, the physical struggle being the least of it. Those years had taken their toll. I died of hepatitis on April 17th, 1986. I was 48 years old. But through all my travails, through the peculiar state of my birth and life, I was never defeated. I'm still speaking. I'm still fighting. I'm still dreaming of a world where a girl born across the color line, a girl born wherever in the world and in whatever way she shows up, can grow up whole. I am Bessie Head. Bessie Head. Bessie Head. How many of you bear names that you have tried to make your own, but you wonder what you would have been called if you could trace the veins of your existence? I'm a writer. I am a mother. I am an exile. I'm a dreamer. My story is mine. And despite all of the machinations of evil people who still exist on exalted thrones, still inflicting their evil, their unresolved demons on others, I live on. And I encourage you to read my books, not because I would think myself so amazing, but for the lessons that I believe they hold. I wrote in my preface to Witchcraft, I like a repetition of everyday events, the weather, the sunrise, or going to the spot every day. It's interesting what you can find when you pay attention, depending on whether that spot is hallowed ground. I believe you spoke with Wangari Maathai, and she talked about the stories her mother had told her, and the tree and the sacredness of that ground, which, having been defiled, affected everything around it, including their water source. I am most unhappy in unholy places. Do you find yourself struggling to find joy? Perhaps you are in an unhappy place, in an unholy place. So while knowing my ideal in the simplicity of my own needs, I continually lived with a shattering sense of anxiety that human beings are unfortunately set down in unholy places. And South Africa, the place of my birth, I swear, it has to be the unholiest of all places. For those of you seeking power, a word of caution. I perceived the ease with which one could become evil, and I associated evil in my mind with the acquisition of power. How many of us get into positions of some influence, of some power, and turn evil? Be careful what you see. So I share with you some of my books, pictures that were taken when I found a reason to smile, and even when I didn't have a reason, I smiled anyway. A woman alone. Yep. When rain clouds gather. I suppose you may have some of my writings as well.
Yeah, Question of Power, Women Alone, and is one she did with Ngugi wa Thiong'o.
Ngugi. And that is to show you that I may be an ancestor, but not that old, because Ngugi still walks the face of this earth.
Yeah.
Some of your parents might be the same age, yes, to stir the heart. Others have included my short stories in anthologies. This is one, Africa South Contemporary Writings, and I am one of many writers whose stories were compiled in this book. My books, my writings are an invitation to deep thought, to critical thinking, to an examination of your own life, to an examination of the structures into which you were born, which ones you've embraced and which ones you may have, that you may be warring against. I would love to be in conversation with you about my books, about my writings, about my thoughts. I hope that they will be an invitation, a calling, a stirring of your heart to be a part of a movement to bring back generosity, to let it grow, to fight the evil that seems to be claiming the earth unabated. You also made a forecast in A Woman Alone, and indulge me. You said racialists in the south of the US are making their last stand. The hardcore of Afrikanerdom in South Africa will also make its last stand. And I think it's happening actually. Come to think of it. Right now. Yeah. I understand that the madman that the Americans chose went off on a public ranting today. Yes, he did. Against a president who I cannot for the life of me understand why he would even go to meet with the madman in the first place. But pray tell, what transpired today? So he was shown a couple of, the president of South Africa he was shown a couple of doctored videos. So it seems the administration never gets tired of using this doctored documentation to make their case. But suffice to say, it was theater. But beyond that, it just shows, as you said in one of your forecasts, that they would make a last stand. And another good doctor that we know would often say, they're going to break it. And they are breaking it. So we're here for it. Let me say this to all of you. And I'm going to read from my book, A Woman Alone. We all love our comfortable grooves and somehow feel safe in patterns of living that have been imposed upon us, even though these patterns are unjust. Think of where you work. Think of where you live. Think of the opulence that you may enjoy, even when just a stone's throw away or scrolling on your devices, you see that there are far too many suffering a different fate. A time of change is a time of upheaval that disrupts the status quo. To what extent will you hold on to your comforts and your status quo? A time of change is also a time when violent passions rampage and terrifying acts of repression are perpetrated by those who wish to resist this change. What we are seeing right now, yes, are the dying gasps of people who know better than maybe those of us who are still being oppressed by them, that they are indeed dying. We must resist. You must, with whatever tool you have at your hand, you must resist.
Speaking of resistance, the resistance continues next week with Rebecca Lee Crumpler. And it's important to continue this conversation because we have loads and loads of women to come, each with their own individual way of resisting oppression, imperialism, racism, patriarchy, and what have you. And we don't just do this because we choose to, but it's because lessons have to be learned. Some of the problem with the world we exist in today is because oftentimes and not, we've not learned from the past. What is transpiring currently in the United States has gone on before, but because we fail to connect the dots, we don't see it happening. So again, women and resistance.
There is so much, if I may. And for those of you who have been listening and who have been sharing and hopefully thinking through this, paying attention to all the ways that women have resisted, and to our men, paying attention to the impact of patriarchy on our quest for freedom. One of the things I observed in Botswana was the breakdown of the family. Of course, we saw that in South Africa, where men were extracted and sent to mines and to plantations. And mothers sometimes even will give birth and then leave their children with their grandmothers so that they could go and serve as servants in the townships. And that fabric of the family becomes frayed. During my years in Botswana, it was commonplace for men to have this sense of superiority, imposing restrictions and repressing the voices and the minds and the spirits and souls of their womenfolk, and yet choosing not to carry the very necessary load of raising those children. Of being present. How do we effectively liberate ourselves if we even talk just about, to the extent that we can talk about race, Black people, African people, when one half is also wedded to the idea of the repression of the other half? We cannot fight ourselves and win. We have so many fronts in terms of this repression that we must examine and be willing to confront. And I know this will not garner me many admirers, but we must look at the role of religion and how it has conquered our minds. And I write about this extensively in my work. We must look at the role of imperialism. We must look at white supremacy. We must look at patriarchy. We must look at tribalism. How can I, as an African, be in another African nation and be nationless? Are we not one people? Did we not come from one source? We must confront the education that has been imposed on us, because that education has propelled us to walk willingly into these prisons of mind, body, and spirit, and to even reinforce them. We have much work to do.
Yes, we have much work to do, and that work continues next week when we look at the lives of Rebecca Lee Crumpler. Again, if this is your first time here, do like, share, subscribe, do all the regular stuff. And if it's a return for you, again, read up on those books, the books of the people that we've talked about. And you can never go wrong, especially with, yes, Bessie Head. I mean, if you don't do anything this summer, read A Question of Power.
Yes.
But do get yourself a box of tissues while you're doing that, because it's a deep read and it's not one to be taken lightly. But then again, like the experience of all the women we've dealt with here, it's a continuation of what the dexterity of the woman spirit shows us, how they refuse to be broken. That in itself is resistance.
And in the words of another writer, Maya Angelou, and still I rise.
Still I rise. Yes. So until we rise again next week, again, from me, good night, sister.
Good night.
And stay woke. Yes.
Indeed.
Good night. That is it for this episode of Women and Resistance. Thank you for joining us in amplifying the voices of women who challenged injustice and changed the course of history. Be sure to subscribe, share, and continue the conversation. Together, remember, we honor the past, act in the present, and shape the future. Until next time, stay inspired and stay in resistance.